connected to YouTube here. Just 1 second. All right, we are all set up with the live stream, and I'll have this posted on our website, and I'll email this to you in just a moment so you can share the link with your family as well. And
Okay.
Dean, you are now.
I can click on the corner view stream on YouTube. Yeah, it starts. Okay.
Yeah, you can access it that way as well.
All right, so we're good to go.
Live stream, and I'll have this posted on our website, and I'll email this to you in just a moment so you can share the link with your family as well. And
Okay.
Dean, you are now.
I can click on. Hi, Dean. Did you happen to see the presentation?
I did. That's all I'm going to say about it. What's the point of having a final presentation if you know all the stuff in the beginning?
That's true. But also, I don't know. So
what I will say is I think it's good that some people forget to do it, which is why I sent you that email reminder. I think it's good that you went back and like brought in all the earlier research and tried to kind of frame it, because, you know, people out there on the web for sure, but Rajesh, who's visiting, you know, he doesn't know anything about what you're doing, right?
yeah.
Whereas, you know, Catherine and Phoebe clearly, you know, already know most of it.
Yeah, agreed. And I mean, it would be very difficult for me to also lay down the argument without the little bit, but I'll aim to finish that like in 10 minutes and then focus on the chapters at the end, which is the design bit for I think 20 minutes.
I mean, in the end, if one were to say, well, what is the value of this piece of work, right? For me, the value of the piece of work is not as much about the individual, let's call it architectural resolutions of local moments. It's about the overall agenda of, let's call it environmental awareness that needs to take place. And that this is just a kind of test case for, right? So it's the larger discussion that is in the end, the critical discussion that one wants to come out of this project as a kind of agency, you know?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I will say about Rajesh, and I'll introduce him. He's not an academic.
Yeah, I noticed.
As you probably saw, right? He's been practicing for 30 years as an urban designer. He is a former student of Simon Atkinson. And I knew him when he was a student.
Mm-hmm.
He came from Delhi. He was, you know, it's probably the same way now, but it was definitely then, right? Like trying to come to the United States and study on an income that was generated in India was very difficult, just because of the differences.
Yeah.
So he made it through the program like with minimal resources, and more power to him for doing that.
Yeah.
You know, and he's managed to make a good life for himself.
Have you been teaching at UT from 89?
No, but I have been teaching since 89. I got as soon as I graduated in 89.
Yeah.
And as soon as I graduated, I won a teaching fellowship at the University of Michigan. So I started there in the 89-90, and it was a 2-year fellowship. And after 1 year, they put me on tenure track. So then I spent another 5 years at Michigan. And then in 95, some friends of mine went down from Syracuse, one of them as the dean, and they kind of like twisted my arm. And so I left and went down to Tennessee. And I was there and I to kind of help rebuild that school. And then I was there for 5 years. And then this sort of urban design position here at UT Austin came open. So I came here, but I was gone for like 12 years between graduation and then coming back to teach here. So I've been here since 2000.
Mhm. That's still 21 years.
Yeah. It's so weird. I mean, at some level, I mean, I say this all the time, right? It's like the only people that get older in this workplace is you. Like all the students are always the same age.
Yeah, that's true, actually. Yeah.
And it is weird to think about my students, you know, who are now my former students, even my early former students, like from Michigan, who are all like, I don't know what, let's see, in their late 40s, maybe 50.
Yeah.
Is that right? No, it wouldn't be
Yeah.
50. It wouldn't be 50. Let's see.
It could be
Let
like
me think about my oldest student. If I take a student, let's say in 89, 90, that was graduating as an undergraduate, let's say they were 22, right?
that is
So
50 because that was 30 years ago.
yeah, so I have students that are like 50, former students, probably. That's very strange.
Yeah. I'll be back in a minute.
All right. Hi, Catherine. How are you doing?
Hi, how are you, Dean?
I'm fine. I invited I think I sent you a note. I invited a fellow who's actually one of Simon's students from 1989.
I saw that in your email. I just saw that. That's wonderful.
Yeah,
And he's from India, so that will be great too.
and he's from India. That's why I invited him. And I knew him when he was a student. And he's done pretty well. He does a lot of work in like Indonesia and places like that, which of course is subjected to massive flooding issues.
Where is
Jakarta.
he? Is he in Indonesia now,
He's-
or is he in India?
His firm is in Baltimore.
Oh, somewhere.
Yeah. But I thought it'd be good to have an outside point of view, although he's not an academic.
Be interesting to hear from him. That's exciting.
Yeah. I think we've, I saw the initial PDF that Maitre sent around. So I think that there's hopefully a good complete argument there.
Yeah, I just had a chance to go through it, and I'm excited to hear her comments on it, just kind of the narrative piece.
Yeah. Now we are streaming this live on YouTube because Maitre wanted her friends and families, some of whom I assume are back in Mumbai. Is that correct, Maitre?
Yeah, actually, almost
Yeah.
all of them are there.
Yeah. So we will be careful with our language and all that stuff.
Hi, Catherine. Are you doing well at the hospital?
I am, yeah, my surgery was Tuesday, so I feel fine, but they won't let me leave until everything's checked out, but thank you. Oh, and here's our guest reviewer.
Rajesh, how are you doing?
Hi. Good morning. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
I wanted to inform you that we are streaming this live on YouTube
Okay.
through the school's website. So just so you know that.
That's fine. How are you
And I'll
doing?
introduce you as soon as we get going here. I think we're still
Sure.
waiting for one other person.
That's your office in the school?
This is my office in the school. There's something weird about the camera that I have that makes it look bigger than it actually is.
I thought it was really big.
It looks big, but it's this sort of high definition, wide angle camera. So don't be fooled.
That's good. I like the books in the back. Yeah.
Well, all my first string books are actually at my house because I have a tendency to lend them to students and never get them back.
Mhm,
So I
mhm.
decided to take all my best books and leave them at my house so that I wouldn't do that.
Okay. And what's the model on your right
That
side?
model is from a former Dallas lab studio, and it was a test of development volumes along the Woodall-Rogers corridor, right adjacent to downtown and the Trinity River.
Okay. Well, thanks for inviting Dean. It's exciting, to get into some academic work because
Yeah.
I've been working with the real projects, and I worked on this big project in Indonesia. It's under construction, but I'm the guilty of doing damage to the environment. It's like a land conversion of 10,000 hectares.
You're working on a 10,000 hectare project in
Yeah.
which part of Indonesia? In
It's
Sumatra
in
or
Jakarta. No, it's in Jakarta, right?
Jakarta?
Off North Java Sea, North Jakarta.
Yeah.
So it's there's a series of islands under construction. So did the planning and all the way to actually the landscape design and building designs on one of the islands. Yeah.
I know Indonesia pretty well because my father attempted a coup there in 1958.
Oh, well, yeah, it's I was there so many times, like 9 times in a year for 3 years, like nonstop. So we're working with the uh, engineers from Holland or Netherlands, who are the water
Yeah.
consultants, and yeah, and we one of the island which we did, what had to have this theme of a river walk in San Antonio, because once you create an island, you need to create ways for the water to go, because the sand cannot all absorb all the water, rainwater. So we used Riverwalk as an idea, and the client loved it. And we went all the way to the landscape design and the buildings around that. So that's under construction. But then
Okay.
we also, yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
we also planted mangroves, which was like, of course, we had to do that. So
Yeah. Well, that's good then. You'll fit right into our conversation. I'm going to get started since Phoebe's here. Good morning, Phoebe.
Hi, everyone.
hi, good morning.
So we are streaming on YouTube, so that you know that. I want to introduce our guest, Rajesh Gulati, who is the Director of International Planning at BCT Design Group, which is in Baltimore. Rajesh is from New Delhi. He is a former student of Simon Atkinson's from the late 1980s and a graduate of UT Austin. Back before it was called an urban design degree, right? It was just a master's of architecture, but it was essentially an urban design degree. And Rajesh has been working, as he was just telling us about, doing a lot of work in Indonesia, and also I see China, South Africa, UAE, basically all over the world, yeah. And then, of course, Phoebe Likwar is an associate professor here in the School of Architecture, professor of landscape architecture, recently awarded the Rome Prize, and we're all excited about that. And also principal of Forge Landscape Architects, which is a kind of up and coming firm. And then Catherine Labernecht, who's sort of joining us as well. I'm going to describe you as an environmental planner, but she's an assistant professor in the community and regional planning program. And both Catherine and Phoebe were kind enough to serve as advisors on Maitre's MDS work. And then I'll introduce to you Maitre Phansalkar, who is from Mumbai, and this is her terminal project before she graduates in a week or so, correct? And so Maitre, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dean. Hi, Phoebe, Catherine, and Rajesh. Thank you so much for attending the final presentation. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes,
Yep.
yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. The project is titled Sequential Urbanism Focusing on Sea Level Rise, case of Ratnagiri, which is a tier 2/tier 3 city on the coast of Maharashtra, a state in India. The presentation is divided into 4 chapters, where I first speak a little about sea level rise, then the coastline of Maharashtra, then the city of Ratnagiri, and then lastly Rajivara, the fishing village in today's project's consideration for intervention. When we look at sea level rise across the globe, India plays a major role when we look at vulnerability. In terms of capital loss, it's second after USA and China. And in terms of population loss, it is It has the most in the world. When we look at Mumbai and Kolkata as the two cities which are going to face displacement due to inundation, and again capital loss due to the inundation in the next 50 years and more. There are several social, ecological challenges that come with the sea level rise. So in terms of social, it's majorly the migration and the population being displaced from their position. In terms of ecological, here we're looking at the diagram from Sundarbans, which is the largest mangrove near Kolkata, largest mangrove in the world near Kolkata. And the depletion of the mangrove coverage area from 1776 to 2014, where it has been majorly happening due to the global warming and the sea level rise. The spatial changes, and here we're looking at the city of Mumbai when it was pre-reclamation, when there were 7 islands and where water was a significant part of the fabric of the city, to the complete encroachment of the city on the water and what it is projected from 2017 onwards. And here the inundation doesn't mean like the complete submergence, but a slow and steady flooding from now, which has already started and heads from here on. And lastly, the economical, which is the loss of the capital. So the current dialogue of sea level rise focuses majorly on 2 things, the capital loss and the ecological loss. But when we look at the country and its linkage to the coast, it's more than these 2 things, because we have this thriving long Indian coast, which has several districts, villages, towns, and cultures and communities that have lived off the coast since the start of mankind and derive their identity, their lifestyle, their food, their clothing from the way it is to live on the coast. So the thesis majorly focuses on this part and aims to shift the dialogue from tier 1 cities to tier 2 and tier 3 cities. Here is a quick mapping of the same on the coast, where we look at Mumbai, Kolkata, Chennai, and Ahmedabad being the major 4 cities on the coast with other districts. And as I said, the coast is a very productive landscape for the country and for the civilization, like for the people who live there. And they derive their occupational and financial, cultural needs from the coast. The coast is unique because specifically now that we look at the state of Maharashtra, because it is sandwiched between the Arabian Sea and the Western Ghat, which create this very rich plateau and coastal plain, which is great for farming and fishing. So now, before I move ahead, throughout the next set of presentation, we're looking at these 3 scales. The Mumbai, which is tier 1 city, Ratnagiri, which is tier 2 or tier 3 city, and then a small village called Achra. And there is a comparison done between these 3 scales to understand the levels of urbanization currently at the coast. So let's look at Mumbai. The land use is primarily urban, where it is residential, commercial, industrial, and there is limited connection to the coast. And similar to New York or any other big coastal city, the major linkage to the coast is recreation, real estate, and real estate primarily. So there's a loss of occupational and cultural needs when it comes to the sea. Then we have the second scale, which is Ratnagiri, a city that's between the village and the Mumbai level scale, also our focus for the presentation today, which has, even though it has a major urban population, it still has its occupational needs from fishing and agriculture primarily. And lastly, we look at the third scale, which is of the village. And this is just an example. And there are so many such villages along the coast, which the population from approximately 90 to 100% derive their occupation from being on the coast. And that means by fishing, the fish market, the agriculture, and the produce. So here are the 3 scales. And this is the coastline of the Maharashtra, along which we're looking at the 3 places where they are connected through an intensive road network and an intensive railway network. So what this does is it creates a successful pattern for migration, but also a spatial linkage that leads towards a forced or a very quick process of urbanization, where the pressures of urban problems of Mumbai will be soon seen on Ratnagiri and eventually at the village scale, because they're spatially and administratively connected. Here is a quick mapping of natural systems over 3 scales, where you can see the severe depletion of the same in Mumbai. Ratnagiri still retains the mangrove villages and the lagoons and the wetlands and other natural systems. And Achra, it's close to 100% at least to what it used to be. Naturally, Ratnagiri, the city that we're looking at, and several other parts along the coast form a great source for fishing grounds and breeding, where we can see the local fishermen move from marine fishing to inland fishing over a span of years. This has happened due to several reasons. One is the depletion of the produce along the in the sea due to sea level rise and other changes. Also due to, because it's very, as compared to inland fishing, marine fishing is riskier. And lastly, agriculture, which again is very linked to the fertile land of the coast. So in Mumbai, it's like you can see it at extreme peripheries, whereas in Ratnagiri, which is also a city, you can see it linked to the cities also on periphery. But in Achra, it's the primary spine of the city that forms agriculture. So here are these 2 extreme within these 3 scales. One is the village, which is has this population that still till date lives off the land and the nature, and starting from the broom they use to clean their houses to the water they drink is very linked to how the natural systems are there. And then is the extreme scale of Mumbai, which is this one of the largest populated cities in the world, and has a very artificial connect to the city, where we have this coastal road that runs, and now it's going to even be more extended by a government project that's coming. So there's this major gap between these 2 scales, and that's where the tier 2 and 3 cities come in place, where they kind of merge these scales and create a new language of urbanization, specifically because right now they're at the cusp of hyper-urbanization. So now we focus on to Ratnagiri, the scale that we're looking at. So this is the city of Ratnagiri, which has these 2 fishing villages. One is called Rajivada and one is called Mirkarwada. They are located, one is located very close to the Kajali River, which is inland, and one is located at the sea. But both the clusters, the fishing clusters, do marine fishing. And as we saw earlier, it is depleting. So which makes these villages even more important and prominent in the dialogue towards marine fishing and coast. So the difference between 2 villages is that Mirkarwada is one of the 3 formally constructed ports along the coast and has a formal intervention done by the government, which has led to a major fishing boom here. Versus Rajivada is a self-sustaining village where the villagers and the community and their organizations work together to form the fishing cluster. And this is the scale of Ratnagiri. So the villages are at the periphery. And this is due to several reasons, of course, that they need to be close to the coast for the occupation, but there is also a role that the caste and the religion plays here, because a lot of fishermen belong to the Muslim community, and there is, while the community is very possessive of the land itself, there is a segregation and a alienation from the city itself. So close to these villages, you will see a more semi-urban scape of Ratnagiri, which looks like this. And here is the top village of Mirkarwada, where the formal port has been constructed. And you can see the way the boats are parked. And this is used by both the local community, and over time, big to medium fishing companies have come and started fishing with the help of the port. So this makes the claim of the community over the land a little vulnerable, as eventually with this way, they will get completely displaced by these corporations. And second is the village which was on the south, which is Rajivada, where the community itself is at the coast, where you can see, and there is no formal port that is being constructed, which means each fisherman or the community have their boats along their houses, and they do it at a very community level. So now I'm looking at the layers of so-called fortification from the coast. So if we look at the sea, and as we move inland, what are these layers that the fishing community has already put in place as we move in? So the first is the boats itself, where the boats are always docked on the sea and forms an integral part of the fabric. Then is the water's edge. This is the village, the Mirkarwada, the former village, which has a more permanent form of the water's edge due to port. And here at Rajivada, it's a more dynamic form because of a constant low and high tide. Then next is the first layer of built, which means the first built structure from the sea. At Rajivada, it's the housing of the community itself. And at Mirkarwada, it's the port and the fishing market. Then is the main street. So now here the main street, the scale of the main street is very different. It's majorly pedestrian, and the vehicles that are allowed are two-wheeler, because for a four-wheeler to kind of access these streets are difficult. But at Mirkarwada, obviously for the trucks to pass, they have kind of strengthened the street. But these are like the two main streets that form the commercial and the social fabric of the village. And lastly, the end of the village. I would call this the end of the village because from here, the city of Ratnagiri kind of takes over and the functions shift. So here till here, the fishing villages have an unsaid autonomy over the land due to the occupation and their presence since the city has been there. So here is a compilation of all these layers, and I would call them layers of fortification because as of now, this is the current system that can cater towards inundation. So if there is inundation, here are at what stages it would happen. So now let's look at the projected inundation, and because at the current stage, without any change in the water rise, there's still water that enters the city and the village during high tide, in months of monsoon, and other calamities. And when the sea level rise increases, here is the second step, and here is the third. So we look at these three stages of 0 to 10 feet, where by the end of it, in the next 50 to 70 years, the village does face 100% displacement chance and vulnerability. So with this context set, we would now look at Rajivada, the village which was on south, which is the focus of the project. So the village is located near the Kajali mangrove, which is a part of the mangrove restoration project done by the state government. There is a bridge that takes it away from Ratnagiri, and this is the Kajali River. So the southern part moves towards the river, and from north, it moved towards the sea. The fishing community here is a marine fishing community. So their fishing occupation, for them, they have to move up here, crossing the bridge from the water. So the village has a clear pattern of density closer to the coast, and as we move away from it, it reduces. And then these blocks come towards the periphery, which is a primary school, a college, some administrative blocks of the city. So visually and spatially, we can say that the lower bottom and the first two bands are the fishing community, and then is the city and its continuation. And the boats are always privately and community-wise owned at the coast. In terms of the prominent buildings or the built on site, the community, as I said, is primarily Muslim. So it has several mosques in the village, which not only serve as religious markers, but they are the place where the community meets, where the gatherings happen, where the fishing community has its union and other things. So they serve as these dynamic socio-culture locations at the village. And as we move away from it, here is the school and the other administrative blocks that I spoke of. So this is the fabric of the village and this bridge that connects it away from Ratnagiri. Now, starting to look at in what ways intervention could happen to kind of work towards the sea level rise, I started making these diagrams and collages to put my imagination to visuals to understand what I was trying to even look at spatially. So here is one scape, which is the coast, where this is an argumentative collage that kind of wants to see what are the possibilities in terms of intervention. Next is the streetscape. And here is again a very quick collage for that. And lastly, the port itself, which is the other village, and how it can be looked at in terms of a sponge towards allowing the water to enter. Just quickly taking back to the layers of existing fortification at the village. So now, from these layers, if you compare these layers, the existing spatial structure to the inundation, it's very similar to the 5 feet, 10 feet, and the 15 feet rise of the sea, where the lower part of the village or the main part of the village can completely be inundated by 10 feet of sea level rise, which is projected by 2070, and the upper part in the next few years, and so on. So the vulnerability kind of scales up. And if we look at these existing road fabric or the city fabric, it forms these transects that cut along all these layers. So it goes from the least vulnerable to the most vulnerable port, cutting these. And when you map them, we get these nodes, which are important because here we look at the port, the unloading of the fishes, the fish drying, and other functions. Then here is the delta where there are the mangroves and programs related to that. And then along this spine are the markets, the grocery stores, and the residential functions of the village. So there are each node has this unique combination of how it's currently being used by the community. And if we look at this complete mesh of the spine, both horizontally and vertically, we get this grid that is spatially the important structure of the village. And if we start imagining these as the productive landscape bit of it, which will then act towards fortification, we get this diagram where we now are interested in looking at how the same spine can now act towards helping and negating the sea level rise. At the same time, this is the gradation of the existing housing in terms of its vulnerability from highest to lowest. And if that green spine is montaged on it, we get this fabric, which becomes this lower half of the village and these several sponges along the village that can and should act towards the sea level rise, which gives us this diagram of the transects that cut along and the horizontal bands that act as these new layers of fortification. So the aim is to create this this middle ground, which acts as the primary defense when the sea level rise comes, and creates this, and this to be created with greener and softer landscapes instead of what is the current build, which is the housing itself. And the second type is these sponges along the village, which are not near the coast, but these lands that are open spaces. So what happens is, because the village is contoured during the 4 months of monsoon, a lot of runoff of water and waste happens from top to bottom. And the result of that kind of is like this, where garbage and other waste is collected towards the coast because of the runoff. And this leads to soil erosion, water runoff, waste runoff. And these are extremely modern day problems that the village is by itself unequipped to take care of. And the intervention of the city with the same has been minimal. So this, apart from creating the lower spine of soft landscape, the intervention also looks at creating these sponges along the village, which would act to kind of hold back the runoff and also take care of the waste disposal and the water runoff at the higher level itself, and it won't reach to the coast as it currently is. With these two main strategies, now I would quickly like to explain the design project. So the design project had these 6 components has these 6 components where each of them have are a type of soft landscape, which I'm introducing at the village level, and which cater towards all these problems of the water runoff, the sea level rise, the waste disposal, and other threats that the villages are facing. So first step was to kind of retain back the wetland and create it as this continuous form of marsh, which currently is my main level of fortification against sea level rise. So this kind of creates this barrier, a soft landscape barrier between the build and the sea, which allows the sea and the sea level rise to kind of get soaked in within the fabric. And at a 3D level scale, it proportionately looks like this. The next step, which I'm calling, is the water cave. It's this conscious dent created in the landscape where the water can go in and get stored. And this is contoured, and the entire marsh is contoured towards it. So as you can see, it kind of slopes down, and so that the water can enter in terms of flooding and eventually in time. So this cave is not created in one go. The aim is that the first layer, the first kind of a pit is created, and then with the force of the water over years, it kind of gets created as a cave. And then when at the mid stage, a retention wall is inserted in a way that the water is held back. So what this does is it creates these self ditches within the fabric where the water can be directed in at the times of inundation. And it's merged with the landscape at most parts because inundation is not daily or even annually in that way. So it would act up as these water caves in times of need. The third is the set of streams, ponds, and mangroves that are restored along the coast, where the ponds or the lagoons help for the pisciculture that is existing. And then the streams kind of allow the entrance of this water in the marsh in order to dissipate the extremity of the inundation in time. The next is the introduction of these water and landscape terraces, the space for fish drying and crab farming. So here the yellow circles kind of are the highland, the higher part within the marsh, which help the community to create spaces for fish drying, which at this point, due to the extensive build there, the community doesn't have this space. And these water terraces kind of are at the edge here, which, if at all there is a runoff, even after the sponges collect that water and help in the restoration and the usage of water for the village. So they kind of cap the movement of water towards the sea. Then is the introduction of the ports so that the people can access their boats. And the other built fabric, which is crucial to the village. So that's majorly the worship areas, which are the mosques. So one is here and here and so on. So then these mosques become these pivotal nodes of culture and community gathering along the entire marsh, which are existing. And they become these institutions that then are also indirectly responsible for taking care of the marshes. Here is a quick picture of the kunds that are used already in very many parts of the country, and how they store water. And this is how this has always been linked to mandirs and temples and mosques. And so the role that religion here plays is creating these special water storage spaces. And lastly, the sponge, which is this part, which looks at several other parts within the city where the runoff from top can be capped at this level itself. And the features here are some farms that allow for soaking, a specific part called Sacred Grove, which which has been historically a part of Indian environmental fabric, where you link the forest to a religious function in order not to like prevent the cutting. So the Sacred Grove and farm kind of form the integral part of the sponge. Along with that, it takes care of the waste disposal and the runoff from the top. So when we look at all of these 6 to 7 stages of intervention, we have this new softscape fabric at several parts of the village. One majorly at the lower part, which is the marsh and the first faucet, and then the sponges itself, which are at the village. There has been, and the restoration of the sponge, the mangrove and the wetlands on the lower part does cause a displacement of 130 houses along this, which then I have looked at strengthening within the village at several other parts, and a density of housing at the top. So the aim of the project is to look at this village where you know that the inundation is inevitable and the displacement is inevitable, but knowing that you have a set of years and these set of strategies, you can limit it. You can, I wouldn't say stop it, but definitely limit it and reduce the impact, and let the fishing community still have its hold over the village. So this way, the fishing community is displaced in by a few meters, but it's still due with the way the soft landscapes are designed, can continue its functions, can continue its occupation, and in fact become the reason why the landscape is restored and not taken by the real estate or not taken by the city for other things, because historically the village has the ownership over the coast. And in terms of an axometric view, the fabric looks like this, where the southern fabric is completely porous. It's this soft landscape which lets water come in and settle, and even from the because the land is contoured and there's a heavy runoff from the top, there are these sponges and several other spaces that kind of hold back the water. So the two problems of sea level rise and the runoff during the monsoon season kind of gets taken care by this system of landscapes. So I wouldn't look at any of these individually, but the whole aim is to look at these as a system, as a whole. The same layers that were earlier of the built now are of these soft landscapes from the sea to inland, which protect the village from the problems of the water. Here are just some quick zoomed ins of the same. lastly, I'm looking at these series of sections. So if we compare them to the similar layers earlier of the boats and the build, now there are these new set of layers, which is the sea, the ponds, the fish drying areas, the steps, and then the market. So the build, which is here, and the sea, which is here, has this entire set of wetland, which is this part, which kind of protects it from these threats that we've been speaking of. So it creates this band of these series of soft landscapes to prevent that. Another section cut through the landscape where we look at crab farming, the restoration of mangrove, the river and the existing mangrove and how they are connected. And then here is where the built and the land and the village begins. And this is a section cut to the sponge, which is this part higher up in the village, where you can see more of the built fabric behind and the kunds linked to the mandir, which become a space of water retention and gathering for waste disposal, and these farms that become these sponging grounds. And then as we move down, we have again the existing wetland. So the third series of fortification. To end the presentation, I would like to end it up with this view where I'm looking at the entire landscape majorly owned by the community, used by the community. This is a series of productive landscapes which have limited aesthetical and real estate value, but the major role that the landscape plays protection of the village, but not just protection, it also adds to the current functioning of the village in terms of the fishing, the fish drying, the market, the pisciculture, the crab farming, and other parts. So the ownership of these lands is completely by the village and the mosque and the temple institutions which have been mapped. And the aim is that this series of landscape lets the fishing village be where it is, which it's been for 1,000 years, yet faces a threat of inundation in the next 50. That's it.
Well, thank you, Maitreya. I appreciate the way in which you've been able to put the entire body of research together into one sort of longer, I think, coherent argument that sort of transcends, excuse me, across a range of scales. So I'm just going to kind of open it up to the reviewers for comments.
Hi, this is Rajesh. I'd like to thank Maitreyi for taking this subject because it's so timely in so many parts of the world, especially in Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, where I've worked extensively on waterfront projects, and of course India, Bangladesh, and many other parts, and I like the fact that what you have done, you have taken series of strategies from a bigger picture of mangroves and wetlands to a very smaller and detailed scale of the 6 strategies you mentioned in design, and try to save this thing, because a lot of what's happening in the world from a commercial development part of it, like developers really don't take care of it, and they just want to reclaim the land and create big dikes and is create a different kind of a world where what you have done is you have tried to save this historic fishing village, and there are many situations in Mumbai and other parts of the India where it can be applied. The only question which I have is how would you implement it? Because it obviously needs a lot of intervention from the village community, but also from the NGOs and from the government organizations, how do you have any ideas how to implement it? Because it is required now, and it's very timely, because we all know that sea levels are rising very fast. And I worked in Indonesia, where people can't grow any more agriculture because it's the water is saline, so it's as same thing happening in Bangladesh. But I really appreciate this topic, and the thoroughness what you've done is very well presented.
Thank you for the question, Rajesh. As you rightly mentioned, it's actually not just about this village or this type, but several of these clusters that are along the entire coast. So the idea is to create, I wouldn't say prototype, but a language of these intervention then which can be applied to several other villages along the coast. So in terms of implementation in India, it's tricky because the role that the government plays here is different. It is not as dominating and intervening as it's in several other countries. We hear specifically here the community has a major hold, which also is a disadvantage because then the resources of the community become the resources of the change and of getting the intervention. And at times, government resources lack to understand and identify the importance of these problems, specifically because most of the dialogue is focused on Mumbai. Most of the dialogue is focused where the real estate value is higher, whereas these villages actually are the ones who live and thrive off the coast, which is where the thesis comes in place. So in terms of implementation, I think I imagine two models. One is of the community itself, and one is of the community and the government. And here the community has to play a major role because we're looking at their strategic slow displacement, at least of 130 to 150. And of course, that number of houses can change with time. So none of these interventions that I imagine are something that are one time done, and let's say for 10 years the area has been dug and unused, but more like a strategic, timely, slow set of interventions that from now till the next 50 years kind of help the village to move back. So how I would imagine this is that the institutions like the mosque, the community grounds, kind of take charge of it and start reclaiming the land slowly, start building the marshes slowly. And first is, and actually the 6 strategies come with its time. So the first idea is to restore the wetland, then is to create the second set, and then, and so on and so forth. In terms of finance, I wouldn't say that my financial understanding or model of this is very strong, but I do imagine that the community here again gets occupation by building these interventions, and then they could specialize in creating this tool of sustainability which can then be taken ahead, and they can become the for a lack of a better word, the organization that creates these set for, let's say, several parts in Mumbai, several parts in Ratnagiri. So they become these kind of creator of this set of landscapes because they are experts in them. They are experts in how to be in those landscapes and restore them and use them. Again, it is expected and hoped, like in the sense the model does thrive off government funding to the village. And that's also because Ratnagiri's major labor economy comes from fishing. So fishing industry is very important to Ratnagiri. And there are the 2 villages that I've mapped are the prominent ones, but there are more smaller ones. So if steps are not taken in the next few years, it is going to lead to a decline of that industry, which has been a part of the coast since a long time. So there is this collaboration that's expected and needed from the city and the community itself, which then leads to the preserving of this area. But just to end it, it's not a one-time major intervention, but more like a slow, strategic, stepped process over the next many, many years.
Yeah, it's a series of small moves, and it's basically, it starts with maybe with the community, as you mentioned, maybe educational campaign first, and making them aware of what's happening and what's going to happen if they don't take these actions, so it's basically, and also making them aware first, and then teaching them at a very small scale, maybe in from the schools itself, so the children can tell their parents and they start getting them involved, and so that and like you said, like creating mangroves first, and so that's the first step which can happen, because we all know that depletion of mangroves is creating havoc, not only in India but throughout the world, including United States, in like Louisiana and stuff, places like that. So it's definitely, I think it's a challenging thing, but you're right, like it is going to happen over a period of time, and maybe you you send your thesis to this village elders, or at least the community level, so they can start thinking of that, and maybe it's just like a seed you're planting, which can hopefully bear some fruits later on.
Yeah, also on similar thing, one thing I forgot to mention, that all the sponges that I imagine along the city are linked to institutes. So here is, let's say, the school. So then again, the school becomes responsible for taking care of the sponge. In terms of, you spoke about the awareness to the community is very intuitive of the problems of these things because they face it on daily basis. In fact, the shift from marine fishing to inland fishing has happened due to a set of these several problems. However, they lack the understanding of the formal language that needs to come with the intervention. So they are aware of the problems because they can see the garbage being collected at the coast because of the runoff and several other things, but they do not have the capacity at a community level to kind of come up with these interventions because they cost, and they also need um, a, a, a special, I won't say dictatorship, but an understanding that what needs to be removed and what, which is very difficult for the community to look at.
Mhm.
I guess I'd like to also say thank you, Maitri, for this wonderful presentation. And, the way that you walked us through was very logical. But also, I really appreciated the kind of nested scales and the multiple scales and comparison of your case studies in the beginning. So I think all of that was really clear and not only relevant to us at this review, but also to very, very easy to understand for, I think, lay people who might everyone from like citizens to planners could understand and grasp your presentation. So I think that's a real strength. You're speaking in language that people can understand, which is I'm often critical of architects and designers for using language that's not understandable. My main question has to do with time and this issue that was just raised of I think the incremental nature of your proposal. I would love to see that in drawings. I think that's something that you could propose and communicate how you envision this happening in an incremental manner. What comes first? What next? And what does that look like? How does it take shape over time? What's your projection for those sort of phases of building or intervention? And then, like, along with each phase, I think this question of, who is overseeing, whose expertise is pulled in, who are the stakeholders, and sort of understanding that picture too, because I think that just develops it further and makes it not only more interesting but more possible. also related to time, there is a line, right? Your strategies go to some imagined line, which is related to some date and time where the water will reach, right? At what was the date where the water will reach this point?
In the current, the current level of marshes, it's around 70 years.
70 years. Okay, so you're projecting 70 years into the future, and this is the new line of the coast.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
my question is, what happens then? There's a way in which I think the proposal could be to have adaptation at that water, like a sort of continual adaptation wherever the water is at any point in time, because who's to say that the water will rise in 70, across 70 years, and then it will stop. You said something about how this is a new language of urbanization, and I think part of that language is adaptability. So not that you're just reimposing a static coastline, but a coastal edge that's better suited to the community, to its to people's livelihood, to retaining culture, to sort of adjusting the sea level rise over 70 years. But I think also it needs to be a new language of this urban coast that also has some flexibility, where as the water continues to rise, you kind of, built into it is a future adaptability. And then my last comment is just that, I think it's really powerful, but the multiplicity of the proposal is very strong, that you're both addressing overland flow from high elevations as well as the rise of the sea, looking really holistically across systems and how those systems are layered and interconnected. So you're strengthening agriculture or aquaculture, and you're also strengthening institutions at the same time. You're thinking about commerce and recreation together. I think all of these things are intertwined in reality, and your proposal also acknowledges that. But I think one question for you maybe to consider is, could this exist without any one aspect? So if you are truly integrating these systems strongly, then if you pull one piece of it out, right, then it couldn't work. But if you can pull one piece of it out, then it seems like it's not really truly integrated and interdependent. So that would be one question that I would ask in a kind of test for you. What if the ponds disappear? What happens? And maybe that sort of forces you to actually dig even deeper to the way that these things are interdependent.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question and the way to look at it. I would say that there is a strength of the fort, which I'm calling this layer, and I think removing components would just reduce the strength of the system. And when I said 70 years, I meant without any change, this is the amount of land that will get inundated in 70 years. But the aim is that with this layer of fortification that I speak, it should push it to, and I don't have an exact number to how much it would, but definitely much more than 70 years. And as you rightly said, it still cannot be the last layer. It has to keep moving, and it has to keep evolving and strengthening. So the aim is to imagine more of these smaller systems that kind of empower the main marshes and the main system and kind of increases its strength. So I think I'm looking at it as this just a degree of strengthening of the landscape in that way over time, and with inundation it just has to get stronger. And
But you can, like, I think there are some parts that seem like they could be pushed into the future, like the terraces, right? You can imagine you just add more terraces, like they grow up the slope as water rises. That is a kind of spatial form that lends itself to thinking about its adaptation through time. But what happens with the walls? You know, I mean, they have an ultimate vertical capacity. And so what happens when that's surpassed? Do they become obsolete? You know, is it sort of, you know, ruins, infrastructural ruins, or do they become something in the future? Do they serve some purpose? Or can they be incrementally, you know, made larger and larger? Is that something that's worth pursuing? I don't know. So I think that, like, actually in terms of spatial form, some things seem to be adaptable and other things are more static. And it doesn't matter if it's 70 years or 150 years, it's still this idea that there's a deadline.
yeah,
You know.
agreed. Yeah.
And I mean, you could even take the position that, like, we can only project forward 50 years or 70 years. And that's all that designers should ever do. So, like, this is that period of time. And then who knows? I mean, like, I'm not advocating that you take that position, but you could. I just think, you know, then you're taking a position.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because the technology and other things keep changing. So there might be better ways after 50 years to kind of add to this system, which are not imaginable right now. Another thing that I would just like to say is that a lot of these strategies are very low cost based. They're not driven by technology that the village doesn't have. So let's say the bund wall or anything that's been created is locally sourced and in the capacity of the community to create them. So we're not expecting any major company or anything to intervene to kind of create these systems.
I mean, I agree with all of the comments so far. I think the project really moved forward even within the last sort of little while, especially with the amount, as Phoebe suggested, the layering of the project and the kind of richness of the project in terms of this sort of almost low tech set of systems. I think is really remarkable how much that has sort of informed the project just even within the last little bit. So congratulations on that. The piece that I, you know, the architect here says, the piece that I also would be interested in seeing a little more exploration of is how we get the people to move their houses and where they move their houses to, right? Like, I think that, you know, the project does obviously, you know, focus on the kind of infrastructural questions, but, you know, their houses are already, at least from your photographs, look like they are under threat even now. And I'm sort of interested in, you know, maybe this goes to like property ownership. Who owns the land that the houses move to? How are there sort of agreements within the village about relocating, and who has to relocate, and how do you get people to actually begin to retreat in order to open up the territories for these other types of systems to be implemented? I think that for me is still a question.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that, like what happens to all of the built fabric that gets inundated. I mean, are they moved? Are people moving structures to a different location, or are they dismantled? What happens to all of those materials? Are they, you know, do they form a new kind of reef under the water? Probably not. But yeah, and I think on the flip side, also like imagining into the future, as you were suggesting that there would be an increase in density. What one area you could go further if you had another month was to think about how building practices might change to create a more adaptable urban fabric, like specifically how is housing maybe built so that it doesn't have to be moved again? Is that even possible? Or looking at the pieces of your current proposal here, like are there building technologies or different ways that we might be building some of these things so that they could be they could have increased longevity.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I don't think I have yet imagined the architecture scale of the displacement, which is very important actually, because in India, if the displacement is led to government, they create these rehabilitation housing, which is very different from how the community's been living. It's these box stacks which are away from the way the village lives and so on. So the community has to kind of and reinforce how the displacement and actually take charge of the displacement. And I wouldn't call it displacement entirely, because I'm imagining the same houses being strengthened along this part and this new density that is being created. So it's more so, even though it is technically displacement, it's just shifting back a couple of meters, or more than a couple of meters, actually a lot of meters, but it still being at the coast and still being at the source of occupation. But I don't think I do have an answer of how exactly the displacement would be created and curated.
Yeah, I think in that case, in moving the houses, it's a very interesting thing, Dean, because these villages, they have their own social structure, and they obviously they have grown very organically, but there are very strategic importance of like mosques or the cultural and religious institutions, so unfortunately if the government gets involved and the bureaucrats get involved, and they will just build this a different kind of way housing, as Metri mentioned, which is not adaptable to their thing, so that'll be a huge thing, so it's a difficult question to resolve, uh, because also in India, like the houses cannot be moved as easily because everything is made of concrete or bricks, it's not
Yeah.
wood construction, so they'll have to be dismantled, and so the village will have to be recreated, and I think that comes from the basic thing, the village needs to be, or villagers need to be involved in at least the fundamental decisions, like if the water is rising, and some houses even now are prone to flooding and stuff like that. So what happens to those houses, and where is the land, and does the village has a land at the upper level or beyond, where they can recreate or at least uh, follow some more different construction practices. So even eventually when the water level is higher, we don't know yet, I mean, it's all predictions and modeling that how much sea level will rise, but we all know it's rising. So it could be 2.5 meter, which is around 8 feet, or it could be 15. It depends on the global rising, etc. But so it's difficult question, but uh, I think that villagers will need to be involved if the village wants to survive with its cultural institutions and the way of living intact.
I mean, I have this sort of weird fantasy of a kind of reverse Hadrian's Wall, right? Where people took material off of Hadrian's Wall and built houses. And I'm wondering whether or not as one dismantles the houses, that the material begins to be used for some of these tiered wall constructions. Like if there are ways to kind of do some adaptive reuse of the materials. I don't know. I would say one last thing from me. the comment about that Rajesh made about, send this to the village, right? I think it would be really interesting to package this project as a kind of almost, I don't know, instructional pamphlet. Like something that actually is, there on the one hand, there's like the MDS that one turns into the university, right? But on the other hand, I think would be interested to try and package all of this almost like as an operating system that could then be distributed through various organizations or whatever to the community as a provocation, if you will.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good strategy. Like in some of the text which is in English could be written in the local Marathi language or the local language, and then it could be passed on to the IS, which is the top level Indian administrative level, like which basically and the collector. But unfortunately, from my experience, the Indian bureaucrats are not very helpful in real life, so but if it can be done to village, and as I said earlier, like if it could be a educational campaign. And I was reading before this meeting, like about the fishing villages in Mumbai. It's a big danger to all the fishing villages, so it's not just this unique village, it's much bigger area. And I think that's, like Dean, she said, it could be at least the beginning of a dialogue and hopefully some implementation. If it's, then the thesis will have much deeper meaning, and I think it'll be more successful if it can be implemented, even at a small scale.
Yeah.
Because what my experience has been working with this large real estate developers, and they don't really care for all that. They just do their maybe they'll plant mangroves they have to, and then they will reclaim the land, and they don't get on with their building high-rise buildings, But this is a very interesting, very deeper and very thorough investigation how you can save a village. And of course, it can be implemented in many villages, because India's economy is still in agricultural sector, and it impacts thousands and millions of people.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very very good investigation, and hopefully it can be implemented.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, congratulations for, I know it was a struggle to get through this piece of work, but I think you should be proud that you were able to kind of pull all this together in a meaningful way. And I look forward to seeing you at graduation.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rajesh, for being a part of the jury.
Thank you, Maitri, and thank you, Dean. Thank you, Phoebe. I like Phoebe's thing, like which is like the implementation timeline. If you can do that graphically, that will be very helpful. Like I think that like.
Yeah, we're losing the
It's always technology.
That will give it a very, if you want to implement it, but that will need more work. But I think it can be done, and it may not, because we don't know how the future is going to unfold, but at least it'll be a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
So Rajesh, thank you so much for joining us. I think it was really important to try and get
I learned something new.
But it was important to get your perspective as someone who knows the landscape and has worked in these areas of the world. And we'll keep in touch, and hopefully maybe even you and Maitreyi can keep in touch. So thank you so much. And Phoebe, thank you as well for hanging in there for the entire time and helping to kind of steer the project.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Congratulations, Maitreyi.
Thank you.
And yeah, congratulations on finishing. I think you did a great job. And I know it was not an easy semester. So wonderful to see the work. Thank you.
It's a difficult topic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Mary. Okay.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.